As you can see, I am now going to talk a little bit more about Australian Standard 4122. Wendy's already mentioned it on a couple of occasions in her part of the presentation, and perhaps we've done that on the assumption that people already know what 4122 actually is. But I've noticed we've actually already had a question in just asking what is AS 4122, so I'm here to answer that question. Okay, so AS 4122 is the Australian standard that has been developed as the agreement for engagement of consultants, particularly in the building and construction industry. The current version of that agreement was published in November of 2010, and I think it's well accepted that this version probably, in many respects, is an improvement, at least from a consultant's perspective, on some of the earlier draftings of this particular agreement. As with a lot of Australian standard documents, it's prepared by way of a committee which is represented by different industry bodies, both from the consultant side as well as the client side. And I guess they work to try and come to a consensus on what is seen as a fairly sort of balanced form of agreement. In the preface to the document, you can see that they've actually described it as providing a fair, reasonable and commercial terms to facilitate widespread utilisation of the standard by all stakeholders. In terms of its uptake within the industry generally, though, as I'll talk about later on, often you see this document being used in quite an amended form. There's lots of industry bodies who are encouraging the use of it in an unamended form, though, including Consult Australia. Some of you might have recently seen that Consult Australia published what they're calling a model client policy, and that's looking at contracting with government in particular. And as part of that document, they are advocating the use of standardised contractual terms when contracting with government bodies, and in particular they're advocating the use of an unamended version of 412 2010. The way they put it is quite persuasive in the sense that they are suggesting that government should be using AS 4122 on an if not, why not basis, where the default position is that all government departments use 4122, and if they want to use a bespoke drafted agreement, that they have to explain why it's not appropriate to use 4122. So that model client policy hasn't been out for very long, so it will be interesting to see whether it does encourage any greater uptake on the use of 4122 by government departments in an unamended form. Look, there are obviously distinct advantages in using Australian Standard Agreement 4122. It obviously promotes efficiency in the contracting process. It's a document that everybody can get access to and familiarise themselves with. So it obviously reduces the time and the expense involved in actually trying to negotiate the terms of, say, a bespoke drafted agreement. And it should improve clarity and certainty around contracting terms. The 2010 version does still contain a number of clauses, well, a small number of clauses, I should say, that have the potential to raise some insurance coverage issues under the terms of a consultant's professional indemnity policy, particularly if it contains what is a fairly common exclusion, often described as the contractually assumed liability exclusion. So you should always reference your policy conditions against the terms of this particular agreement before making a decision to use it. For those of you who are planning to cover clients, we have actually prepared a practice guide on the standard terms of AS 4122 that's available to you, which sets out our comments on those outstanding potential insurance issues. The underwriter of the architect's facility policy, which is currently Vero, is also looking, I think, to try and advocate the use or encourage the use of 4122 in its unamended version as an agreement to engage consultants in the construction industry. And to do that, they have placed an endorsement on the policies available through the architect's facility, which actually provides for cover to be available for liability arising from a breach of unamended standard terms of 4122, despite those insurance risks that I talked about earlier on. It's important to note, though, that the endorsement on the policy will not apply if any of the terms of the standard form contract have been amended. And as I mentioned earlier, we do often see this agreement land on our desk in a very amended format. Drafters of contracts are entitled to amend this agreement under licence. Importantly, though, in the 2010 version, they added a section to the first annexure which required the drafter of the contract, or the person completing the contract, to actually disclose whether any of the clauses have been amended from their original version. So just to show you exactly where you should be looking to find out whether there has been any amendments to this standard form contract, in Annexure Part A, which is the first annexure after the terms and conditions, the very last item of that annexure is item 31. And you can see that we've highlighted there, and it says, has the contract been amended from its original form? And those who are completing the contract are obliged to circle either yes or no. Look, sometimes we do see amended contracts come through and we know that they're amended because we're familiar with the standard terms, but that annexure hasn't been completed. I get concerned that sometimes with amended versions of 4122 that people take a little level of comfort from seeing the Australian Standard logo on the front and assume that therefore the contract is a relatively sort of balanced agreement. So it is particularly concerning if it has been amended and not marked up as being amended in that annexure. So if you're not certain as to whether there's been any changes made to the standard form terms, you should make sure that your client actually completes that item 31 to disclose that. They need to go further than that, though. They need to also then, if the contract has been amended from its original form, go to Annexure Part B and actually set out those clauses that have been amended, deleted, and new clauses which may have been added to the contract. So it's helpful when those are completed and you can see what actually has been changed from the standard terms of the contract, but sometimes the amendments are presented in a way that is difficult to then merge back in with the standard terms. Obviously, when you get a great deal of amendments to these standard terms, you effectively end up with what is a bespoke contract, which does diminish those efficiencies that we were talking about of using a standard form. And also you then need to go and work out how the amendments sit with the standard form terms which remain. Sometimes we see them in a very sort of lengthy table form, which talks about certain clauses or certain words within clauses having been deleted and replaced by others, and then go on to add additional clauses on top of that. We also can sometimes see special conditions which are set out in sort of long format. Neither of these ways of amending the contract are particularly ideal because, as I said, it is difficult to marry up the changes to the contract with how they fit back into the standard terms, making it difficult to understand, I guess, the resulting impact of those amendments if you can't see the contract terms in full. So ideally, you want to get from your client a marked up version of the contract where any amendments, deletions or additions that they've made to the standard term actually sit within and are incorporated within the body of the document, so you can read it as a single document and understand the implications of those amendments. Look, this is an example of a particularly sort of difficult contract that was sent through for me to have a look at by one of our clients. It purported to start off, well, it did start off, I guess, as 4122/2010 and had the cover sheet to go with it, which, as I said, look, I think sometimes gives consultants a level of comfort that they possibly shouldn't have when the contract then goes on to be amended. This had 19 pages worth of special conditions then attached to the contract. And the special conditions were just really set out in that sort of long form style that I was talking about before. So quite difficult to then, reincorporate back into the contract terms to work out the implications of what had been amended. There were new clauses there that dealt with things like fit for purpose, which isn't in the Australian Standard original agreement, design certification, which, as Mindy mentioned, isn't something that is otherwise in the standard form. There was an additional indemnity which had been included. There was a provision that required the parties to contract out of the operation of proportionate liability legislation. So some quite significant changes to the contract were made in those 19 pages of special conditions. So it wasn't given as a marked up as a marked up contract. So as I said, it made it all the more difficult to try and reconcile that and work out exactly the risk profile that had now been created by these amendments.